Well, good morning and good afternoon for some. My name is Jennifer Joyce, and I am the Regional Vice President of Sales for the Western Territory here at Conducive, talking to you today about how you can achieve a 2x faster SQL experience guaranteed. And I just wanted to thank everybody for attending today and for joining. Just a couple housekeeping items here. This webinar is really broken out into two parts. The first part is really what we'll refer to as the thought leadership portion of this webinar, where we really just dig in under the hood, kind of get under the technology stack to explain really what are some of the I/O inefficiencies that are occurring, some I/O degradation issues that are occurring in the environment, especially if you're running SQL servers, particularly if you virtualize that environment, and just kind of get in on what's happening under the hood that's stealing the underlying IOPS and throughput that's causing your underlying storage subsystems to work much harder than it should be, and ultimately why you're getting less performance than you actually should on your SQL workloads. So that's really the focus of today's conversation. And, there's some inherent I/O penalties that are occurring, and, we'll bring a couple of those to light today, and then once we've given you that overview, that'll be pretty quick, no more than 10 minutes, we'll give you that overview of what our software does. And really, just kind of as a lead into that, it's just set and forget software utility that runs in the background on Windows servers. And it's really designed to tackle those I/O inefficiencies that we're talking about solving so that we can guarantee that, at least for our customers, that 2x faster SQL experience. And obviously, kind of a compelling event, about that, what other way are you going to get that kind of performance boost on those servers other than, having to buy expensive hardware, just throwing more iron at the problem. So we're a unique solution that can solve that problem with a 100% software approach. And at the end of the webinar, we'll also be giving that complimentary NFR, more than a $500 MSRP value to you, because ultimately the proof is in the pudding. And I want to go ahead and take a moment here to introduce my partner in crime, Howard Butler. Howard is the Senior Director of Systems Engineering here at Conducive. And for any of you car aficionados out there, if you're ever on a one-on-one call with Howard, not only does he specialize in accelerating performance in computers, he's also a race car instructor. So he specializes in not only making computers go faster, but also accelerating cars whenever he gets a chance. So Howard?
Hey, Jennifer. Thanks very much. Always glad to join you here. And, don't let her fool you guys. She's quite technical as well. She's the Regional VP of Sales. And so, she knows her stuff in terms of our product. And one thing I did want to mention to you, Jennifer, is that we do like to make this session rather interactive. So there is a Q&A box up there in the upper right-hand corner that allows you to post questions as Jennifer and I discuss the material and so forth. So please, if you do have any questions, just type them up in there, and we'll try to get to them kind of as an interaction or interactive part of the discussion here, but we may save some for towards the end. So thanks very much, Jennifer, for the introduction.
Yeah, that's great, Howard. And guys, just to kind of build on what Howard was just saying, when you do type into that your questions, and please do put them into the Q&A chat box rather than to individuals, because we're going to be monitoring that chat box. We might miss them if you send them to us privately. We're going to go ahead and have a full Q&A session at the bottom of the hour. We may be able to touch on a couple of questions throughout the session as well. But my main thing here is that if you're thinking the question, probably somebody else is as well. So go ahead and throw it in there. Don't be shy about that. Now, we're going to go ahead and advance to the next slide here. And if you're joining us today, you may have not heard of Conducive Technologies before. And John, I just wanted to see if we could advance to the next slide. I don't have slide control on my side. Thank you very much. Awesome, perfect. So, okay, so for those of you who may not have heard about us before, Conducive Technologies, you may kind of be scratching your head going, well, gosh, who are these guys, and why do they even think they have any place to be speaking about thought leadership on the topics that we're talking about today? So, I certainly am not one to belabor and spend a lot of time on corporate slides. I personally don't like that when other people do it. I want to get right into the content, but a little bit of kind of obligatory who we are information for you, just to get an idea of where our street cred is coming from. We'll keep this short. We're actually a 35-year-old software company We're the 12th oldest software company in the world. And you know, we originally started out as a company known as Diskkeeper, and some of you may have heard that. Some of you may have even used us on, you know, optimization for hard disk drives in the past. But about 5-6 years ago, the company brought out some really revolutionary intellectual property to the marketplace, and it had absolutely nothing to do with fragmentation. And really what it's all about now is reducing the noisy I/O. There's just all this noisy and unnecessary I/O, as it turns out. And on any given SQL Server system, there's about 30 to 40% of the I/O traffic that's just pure noise. It's just stealing IOPS and stealing throughput. In fact, it ends up that those customers of ours who tend to add just a little bit more memory or manage the memory properly within SQL to really take advantage of our software, they're offloading half of their I/O from storage and getting those 2x faster gains that we're talking about. Now, for this effort and for this work, Gartner did tag us and kind of tap us on the shoulder with the Cool Vendor of the Year when we launched this product into the marketplace. And we've now had the product in the market for about 5 years. And it's had really nice growth. It's now used by well over 2,500 mid-market large enterprise customers. And there's various iterations and kind of pieces of our technology that are also OEM'd. And you can kind of see some of the OEM partners there, the Samsungs and HPs and Lenovo's of the world. And if you haven't heard of us, clearly you've heard of them. And we've also had and continue to have very close relationships with Microsoft and VMworld. And Howard, this is kind of a big one. Speaking of Microsoft, I know that you were really closely involved in this initiative a couple months ago, but they named us as their first ever, the first and to my knowledge, the only software vendor certified for their SQL I/O reliability programs, and that's a pretty big deal.
You know, you're right, Jennifer, and you know, I do consider this a pretty elite type of certification. I mean, Microsoft has certain levels to make sure that other applications like ourselves, you know, are fully compatible with their software, and in this case, SQL Server. And as you said, we're the only software vendor in there. But we're in pretty good company, you know, with the people like, you know, EMC, Dell, HP, and a few others there. And, you know, besides all the testing, we also had to go through a pretty rigorous panel, Q&A session with many of the Microsoft SQL experts to get past this and get this certification. So I kind of consider this a pretty, you know, well-to-do feather in the cap for us.
That's awesome. And so before we jump into the kind of the thought leadership portion of this, we'll go ahead and move on to the next slide here. And what I want to do is just give a little bit more background here of kind of the conversation that surrounds this. And kind of what's happening around this unnecessary noisy I/O traffic and the effects that it's causing. What's the degradation issue that's really stealing the performance? And the couple opening slides here on this real quick. We've done some market research, and we've been doing this for the last 3 years now, where we've conducted this survey. We believe it's the largest independent survey study done on I/O performance. We've had over 1,000 IT professionals respond each time, and there's a couple of very pointed questions that we're asking, but the one that I really want to focus on that we've got some answers here on the slide for are when you say, really we ask them regarding, you know, all these hard-hitting apps running SQL. You know, how many of you, raise your hand, how many of you have had performance problems so bad that you're actually getting staff or customer complaints due to sluggish performance? You know, it's like slow queries, slow performance, batch jobs taking too long. And if you look at the graph, you'll see that 28% of all of the organizations raised their hand this last time we did the survey, saying that, yeah, we've got some SQL performance bad enough that we get complaints. And you know, the previous 2 years, we get pretty much the same answer. Last year it was 27%, so not demonstrably different than this year, but you can see there's just kind of this slow creep of this I/O performance gap between what's being demanded from the application and what the underlying storage and server storage is able to actually deliver up on I/O performance. So the likelihood that you're on this webinar is because you're probably in that 28%. You know, just letting you know you're in good company. There's no surprise here. You know, basically more than 1 in 4 organizations are having a very similar issue, and looking for solutions that are cost effective and really other than kind of forklift upgrade type of options to do here. So in continuing on with this, when we when we ask this question of all your IO-intensive apps that you support, which one is the most challenging, you can see the results in the word cloud here. Just hundreds of responses coming in, and SQL is dominant. And you can see the other kind of database, BI, ERP, SAP kind of things are also really coming out there. But SQL really is our sweet spot. And just anybody on the webinar, this webinar is focused on SQL. Our application Velocity is application agnostic. As long as it's running in Windows, we can do something to help. But SQL is the one that I'd say 7 out of 10 new customers that come to use our software start using our software because of something they're running in SQL. Now I'm just going to jump into the next slide here, and I think the setup was long enough. So I want to give you a picture here before we go into the IO degradation portion of this, of what really I think it helps to start with what's the end game. What's a healthy IO profile look like? What's an optimal IO profile look like when you're getting the optimal performance? So as you can see here on the screen, this is, I realize this is oversimplified. This is just a very rudimentary extraction, obviously, of your IO profile and kind of the data path. But I think the takeaway is pretty obvious and immediate. What we're really illustrating here is that you get nice, large, clean, contiguous writes and reads in the ideal state. When you're getting, a healthy payload of data with every IO operation, you're getting more KB per IO. You can notice also the sequential nature of how your traffic looks. That's really optimal. That's what we're really going for, to kind of offload as much of that IO and get as much IO performance as we can from your underlying flash hybrid or disk storage. Now, the thing is that once you take one of these SQL servers and you virtualize them, well, now, and obviously in a Windows context, you're not going to be getting what you see here. Instead, you're going to be getting what you see here on this next slide. Now, by taking a quick look at this, from what you saw before to what you're seeing now, there's another immediate takeaway. So suddenly, you're now in this environment where the IO characteristics are much smaller, they're more fractured, and they're more random than they need to be. And I kind of like to coin the, phrase this as like a death by 1,000 cuts scenario. And really what's happening is the underlying architecture is having to process unnecessary workloads. And ultimately, it's having to work much, much harder than it actually needs to be. And I kind of liken this to pouring molasses all over your flash storage and your hybrid, your disk storage, because now you're penalizing storage performance with what we call the perfect trifecta for bad storage performance: small, fractured, random IO characteristics. And the interesting thing here too is that a lot of folks might raise their hand at this point and go, yeah, I got a pure storage, I got 200,000 IOPS, so I don't need to reduce 30 to 40% of my IO, so what? That's actually a really interesting question I get asked sometimes. And the way I look at that is, we're not looking at the 200,000 IOPS. We're not even looking at the IOPS. We're looking at the IO themselves. And I'll give you just a quick analogy. I'm about 5'3". I walk into a room, and it's got 20-foot ceilings, and I need to get from one side of the room to the other. Well, I got 15 feet of airspace above me, and it is useless to me to be able to walk from my side of the room over to that side of the room. I can't use it. I got to use the 5 feet of space I'm in. And if there's 300 people in this tiny, small room, it's going to be really challenging for me to get from one side of the room to the other. So if I can remove 30 to 40% of the people out of the room, they're gone. And then I can sequentialize the rest of the people and put them in nice rows or lines, I can now move through that room very quickly. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the space that is being used, that 10,000 IOPS that is being used. Let's change the nature of that. Let's remove IO from that. So that's what the conversation is about today. And if we dig into the hood a little bit more, what's actually going on, there's really 2 IO penalties that we're talking about. Now, I was just starting to allude to the second one. Or to the first one, actually, what I'm going to cover. I'm actually going to kind of go in reverse order here. I'm going to talk first about the IO blender effect, which you see on the bottom of the slide there. Now, this is actually a term that we coined we helped Gartner coin about 5 years ago when virtualization was really now, being adopted, and probably even 6 years ago now when it's really coming in heavy and people were starting to get up into 60, 70% virtualization. Now everyone's at 90% plus. But what happens with the IO blender effect is that the moment that you virtualize more than one server and you put more than one server on that host, on that hypervisor, you're basically, kind of getting rid of that one-to-one relationship of server to underlying storage. You're entering in cross-traffic now, and there's no fix for what happens when you do that. and as great as virtualization is for server efficiency, one of the biggest downsides is that it adds complexity to the data path. And what happens is that the host hypervisor now mixes and randomizes otherwise sequential I/O streams and now delivers to storage a more randomized pattern. And the moment that you add a third VM, a fourth VM, a fifth VM, a sixth VM, guess what you're doing? All you're doing is just amplifying the effects of that randomization even further. Now, most organizations don't see the full performance penalty that comes with virtualization at the beginning because they have a tendency to virtualize slowly over time. But some of our biggest and best customers are those that went from 100% physical to 100% virtual overnight, just kind of flip the switch. And Howard, one good example that I always like to bring up is a customer of ours that, in fact, you and I were just on site with recently out in Texas, Christus Health. One of the top 10 largest healthcare providers in the U.S. located out of Texas, and they virtualized one environment, had over 2,000 servers basically overnight. And Howard, I just want to kind of turn it over to you because I know you've got some insight into that event. Maybe share with us what happened.
They did, their testing on individual systems, and they expected that what they went from physical to virtual, that they get the same performance. But in reality, when they did virtualize all those systems, unfortunately, they did not get the performance that they were expecting to achieve. They saw performance degradation during their analysis, and what they found was that it was not CPU, it wasn't memory, it was an I/O bottleneck, Jennifer, and that's what caused their issues. Now, their first reaction was, now we got to go and upgrade all of our storage, add to the expense and complexity of, implementing an all-flash array to try to solve those issues. But before they did that, they got a copy of our software, and we solved those I/O performance bottleneck issues. So rather than them spending $2 million for a new flash storage array, we were able to save them from doing that, and they invested in using our software, which was a significant cost savings to them rather than spending the $2 million in hardware.
Yeah, it's exactly right, and I appreciate you going over that story for us. And anyone who wants to read about that, you could go to our website and get the case study directly from the website about how we doubled the performance for them and how we were able to keep their infrastructure that they had and keep that iron in place without doing that forklift upgrade. And we've actually just refreshed that case study with them because they now have us on over 2,500 VMs across the enterprise. And in fact, they had all along, and we refreshed the case study to highlight that. So go to our website and grab that. Now, that's really the kind of a summary of that first penalty I wanted to talk about, the I/O blunder effect. Now, on the top half of the slide is what we like to call the Windows I/O tax. That's the other penalty. And I kind of went out of order here in talking about them a little bit, but if you're just now joining the webinar or you didn't quite catch the beginning, if you were on earlier, you may have heard some allusions to this, but we're actually the ones who have the expertise to be able to explain and solve this. We're the only people that have the proprietary software that can solve this. And the problem is that the Windows operating system is very inefficient with how it handles organizing the data. And once you virtualize, it gets even worse. There's some severe inefficiencies in the handoff of data between the Windows OS and the underlying storage. And there's no APIs that connect the two other than using the rudimentary framework that Windows already has. And really, we're dealing with the logical disk level here, Howard, and this creates a real serious problem because what happens is the Windows operating system for any given file that should be written and read with one I/O or two I/Os or just three, just a minimal number of operations, Windows ultimately takes any given file and breaks it down to be much smaller than it really needs to be. And ultimately, what happens is when you end up having Windows do this, you get a situation where you're processing, 4 I/Os or multiple I/Os for a single file that really could be written or read with just one I/O. So Howard, maybe I could turn this back over to you. Just tell us a little bit about what's actually happening here. Why is Windows so efficient in the handoff of data?
Well, the Windows file system truly does take a one-size-fits-all approach, Jennifer. When a file gets created or extended, the Windows file system definitely doesn't know how big it's ultimately going to grow or be. But what it will do is that, and this is done on the logical side within the Windows file system NTFS. It looks for the next fixed location. And if that file extension is bigger than that, it'll write or fill up what it can into that section of free space. And then it will go on and find the next allocation, write what it can, rinse and repeat that type of process until it's written all the data. And with each of those individual separate extents or allocations, there's an extra I/O involved in doing that. So now you're getting all these very small random I/Os rather than a more efficient sequential type of I/O. And then later on we're going to go in how we solve this. But as you can see, now you're getting all these small random I/Os that's coming from the system itself. And if you ever look at benchmarks of storage, they give you two type of measurements. They'll give you measurements for random I/Os and a performance measurement for SQL I/Os. And you will always notice that those nice sequential I/Os tend to outperform the random I/O traffic. So if from our software vantage point, we can help Windows enforce that the system is to do those nice sequential I/Os, you're going to get the best performance out of your storage.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the random versus sequential I/O. And I do see that we've got, it looks like our first question in the chat box, and the short answer is yes, and we'll cover that in more detail in the Q&A session. So this is a good moment to just remind folks that as you start thinking of questions, this is a good time to start dropping those in so that we've got some stuff there for the bottom of the hour when we get to the Q&A session. So Howard, thank you for your illustration there. And you know, one thing I'll mention, this isn't on a slide or anything, but we did just publish a case study recently with the University of Illinois, and this is a really good example of, you know, hard-hitting databases. For them, it was Oracle running within Windows, and then they also had some SQL databases too, but they were running those Oracle databases on the latest Dell servers, and they had the latest Dell compellant flash arrays, and on day one it was fine, but after about a year, performance had really degraded, and they thought they were just going to have to buy some more flash arrays, you know, to get more IOPS to meet the SLAs, but they came across a webinar like this and heard about our software, and they learned the evaluation's free. They figured they had nothing to lose, so they installed it, and it doubled their performance. And it was already on their existing flash array. So kind of what I was talking about is, you know, optimizing the space that is being used and making it much, much more efficient, 30 to 40% more throughput, less I/O. And it kind of shocked them actually to figure out that, hey, flash isn't enough. It can't always keep up, and just how inefficient the Windows operating system could create this, you know, very difficult to process randomized non-sequential data pattern. And even with the latest new big iron sitting there, just all over time couldn't keep up. So we'll move on to the next slide now. But as I mentioned, and Howard and I both mentioned that we'd just give you a really quick overview of how we do this, what it does to solve the problem now that we've really set the table on what the problem is. So, and then after this, we'll get into the handoff of the NFR that we're going to be giving you so you can download it. It installs seamlessly, no reboot required, takes less than 5 minutes to start seeing the benefits in your environment. But again, so the solution, Velocity, is I/O reduction software. It is literally set and forget software. In fact, our company actually has the copyright on the phrase set and forget. Has had it for many years. And it installs right into the Windows operating system. It's a very thin filter driver, and it's got nominal overhead. We just refer to this as near zero overhead. We would even challenge you to see the CPU footprint. It's so enormously lightweight. And whatever CPU resources it is using, it's running at the absolute lowest priority, so it's never interfering with server performance. And what the software is doing is actually offloading I/O from the underlying storage, and then at the same time, whatever I/O is there, as Howard mentioned, it gets streamlined. So that I/O traffic is now streamlined. So it becomes that friendly I/O profile for your storage to process that we were looking at in the very first slide of that healthy I/O profile. It's much quicker. And we do a couple of things different. We have 2 patented engines within the software that you should be aware of. And the first engine really deals with write optimization, and the second engine deals with read optimization. So let's talk first about what we're going to be doing to optimize your writes, and then we'll talk what we're doing about about what we're doing to optimize your reads. Now, Howard, I'm going to start on this just real briefly and turn this over to you in just a second, but let's talk on this first engine about write optimization, IntelliWrite. So what we're talking about is that Windows has, as you mentioned earlier, Windows is looking for this next available allocation of the logical disk layer. Whether it's the right size or not, it's going to use that next allocation. Now, we'll give Windows a little bit of credit because in the sense that, on day one, it's a freshly formatted NTFS volume, and, we're probably going to be getting that ideal I/O performance on day one, but it's going to start degrading, and those free spaces and the correct size allocation is very quickly going to erode underneath us. So that sequential traffic starts to evaporate and becomes randomized, small, split, chopped up traffic. So at the beginning, you're getting the nice, clean, contiguous writes and reads, but Howard, as time goes on and files are written, erased, rewritten, extended, that space really starts to degrade and break down. That's where the problems start really coming in. One example would be like if you're trying to write a 64K file and the next available space is only 4K, well, it's going to fill it. And it's going to split, find the next available allocation, fill it, split, and as Howard said, rinse and repeat until that file is fully written. And Howard, we have patented technology that can solve this problem, and maybe you could just share with us a little bit about the intelligence that we're dealing with to kind of, get Windows to behave properly in this regard.
So yeah, Jennifer, as I said before, the file system doesn't know how big a file creation or extension is going to be. So as you said, it just looks for the next allocation. Well, we're going to do something very simple. In the background, we're monitoring what's happening on the system, and we're saying to ourselves, hey, if this file type or this application, when the file gets created or extended, if we know from our behavioral analytics that we're monitoring and seeing how big that file is going to be, we can feed that intelligence back to the file system. So now the Windows file system knows exactly when this file is being created, it's going to know where is the best allocation to put it. So therefore you get nice sequential writes occurring rather than all these dispersed and chopped up small little tiny random writes. Windows is now writing the data in a much more efficient manner. So you can see now, it's very simple that we're just providing that intelligence to the file system so it can do a better job. And I like to use this analogy. If you want to carry a gallon of water from one place to another, you could do that in 100 individual small little Dixie cups and go back and forth and back and forth. Or you could do it in just one big gallon jug and do it all in one motion or one operation. And that's essentially what we're helping the Windows file system to enforce or do. The end result is you're getting nice sequential writes, which is much more efficient and more optimum to process, Jennifer.
Well, thank you, Howard. And one thing I'll just mention is however it writes is how it reads. So if you're getting nice sequential writes, you're by default getting nice sequential reads. And I think one of the other net takeaways here is that this intelligence is really helping the Windows OS find the best allocation of the logical layer, since really the next available space is rarely, if ever, the right size. And now, Howard, we'll transition a little bit here because as powerful as that engine is, there's another engine which probably even does even more. And this one is our read optimization engine. So, Dawn, let's advance the slide on this one as well. Thank you very, very much. So this is really different from the first engine. This is actually it's DRAM read caching. And I guess one of the ways that kind of a catchphrase I like to describe this as is we're establishing a tier 0 cache strategy. And so we're basically just leveraging the idle available DRAM sitting there on any given VM or physical server, and we're just utilizing a portion of that memory that's sitting there doing nothing and putting it to good use. Otherwise, it's sitting there, getting wasted, and we'll just serve hot reads from it. So, kind of if I really focus in on what the real genius of this engine is, one is it's completely automatic. You do not have to carve out or allocate any memory for cache. The software is aware moment by moment of how much of your memory is unused at any given moment. It's only going to use that portion that is free and idle at that time to serve hot reads. We're basically borrowing the resource. We'll give it back if something else calls for that resource. So that way you're never going to run into an issue of resource contention. You're never going to have to worry about memory starvation because the intelligence of the engine is just completely dynamic. Now, obviously, it's dynamic to the point that if you've got a really heavy workload going on and you're memory constrained, you're under peak loads, maybe it's 3 p.m., everyone's pulling reports, well, the caching engine is simply not going to kick in. It'll sit idle. It'll sit on the side, and if you're memory constrained, using all your memory, you know, don't worry about it. We'll be out of there. But if you're just slightly over-provisioned on memory and you're not using all of it, then the software will put that excess to work. And I know one of the things that people first think a lot of times when they hear this is, well, when it comes to caching, to be effective, you need to have some pretty big capacity. You need to have a lot of memory, and that's just not true in our case. We found that if customers just maintain around 4 gigs of free memory on most of their systems, that we're going to be able to offload up to 50% of the read traffic from storage. So it's not just about being capacity intensive. It's also the sophistication of the behavioral analytics engine, and that's so powerful that we can leverage just a little bit of DRAM to get that kind of a result. And keep in mind as well that reading from memory is going to be 10 to 15 times faster than reading from SSD. So just a little bit goes a long way in reducing and offloading a lot of those noisy IOs. And Howard, maybe I could tap you on the shoulder to just, you know, illustrate a little bit more about this tool.
Well, you know, you're right, Jennifer. There's 2 things that are very unique with our IntelliMemory caching, and that's one of the reasons why 9 out of the top 10 PC OEM manufacturers license our technology. So, of course, you haven't heard of us because they license the product under their name. But the 2 things, as you indicate, is dynamic memory usage, and we'll use only what's available. So not being, you know, if that memory is not being used out there, or if any other system or user process wants that memory, we can automatically give that memory back to Windows so there's no memory contention from the application or Windows or anything like that. Now, the second part is, as you know, our intelligence of what to put and keep in the cache for the best benefit. You know, we're just not a caching strategy of, hey, you read it once, let's load it into cache. There's got to be a compelling reason for us to bother about placing it into the cache. So, you know, like a lot of caching technologies, you know, like they said, they'll just read it once and then they'll put it in the cache and hope that it gets read again. We don't do it that way. We're actually monitoring the system in the background and seeing what data, first of all, you know, what data is going to get cached, and then second, of that data, how do we want to best keep it in the cache? What are the hot blocks being accessed and so forth? So there's actually, you know, from our determination on this, we've actually seen that there's a small amount of I/O traffic that really does cause the biggest dent in performance. And that's what we want to attack and give that performance back to the system. So, you know, when we're looking at this, we can determine in a more intelligent way what we want to cache to further reduce the repetitive reads and those noisy, small read I/O traffics that are causing the biggest headaches for the storage environment to process. So that's where you're going to see those big performance gains. And it'll just offload the traffic from having to go to storage and increase the bandwidth at the network so it can do additional work.
Yeah, and guys, if you're a Gartner client, you can check in with them, and you know, they call us the world leader in DRAM caching technology, and we don't know that we are for sure, but we believe we've sold more caching licenses than any other player in the marketplace over the years. So let me just transition here and just outline some real-world use cases, and I know we're getting a little short on time here, so I'm not going to read all of these. I'll just highlight a couple, and you can go over to our website. All of these are published in case studies in addition to others, and most of these are citing at least a doubling performance in SQL. And other IO-intensive systems. But a good example here, center screen, is ASL Marketing. They had a huge import batch job that they were doing, and I was lucky enough to be working with this account, did the installs, and personally saw this story myself. This thing had millions of records, and it would literally take 27 hours to complete. And this was supposed to be an overnight import. Well, do the math, that's not overnight. So they did not have the budget at the time to rip and replace their hybrid storage and throw in all flash. So what they did was they tried our software, and we got it down to 12 hours. I'm the one who got the call going, you're not going to believe this, and I didn't believe it, but it actually happened. So it was a 15-hour reduction. And another one on here, Stockport College, that's a really neat story as well. I got to read that one, as you can do on our website as well if you want to take a look at our case studies. But that one, they were having 15 minutes to enroll one student on enrollment day, and the systems would be crashing. Again, they weren't going to be upgrading the hardware, so they went back and installed our software, and we dropped the 15 minutes down to just 5 minutes. So we got them back to meeting their SLA, and then they started using us on some other applications. They threw us in on this long-running payroll batch job on SQL, and that one went from an hour. And this is more than mileage varies. This one's really extreme. We went from an hour down to 10 minutes on that particular batch job. That's pretty phenomenal. But that being said, let's go to the next slide and move on so we can get down to the best practices part of the webinar here on installing the Velocity software. But here's another couple examples. I'm just only going to touch on one here. I'm going to touch on Alvernia University. They had 3,000 students all accessing their LMS package, taking tests, timeouts due to the I/O demand during the middle of tests, which obviously is unacceptable in an academic environment. So they also went with our software as the solution over replacing hardware. We doubled the performance, and more importantly, all of the timeouts stopped. We were able to get them, a lot more life out of their hardware, and in an education budget that was very meaningful to them. So we're just going to take a quick look here at the UI, quick screenshot of the UI here of what this looks like. And really, again, this is 100% software utility running in the background, just doing optimization real time. And really the only time you need to pull up the UI is just to see kind of, hey, what's this doing for me lately? You can filter this by different days, last 24 hours, last 7 days since installation. Right now we've got a view here that a customer sent us from a live production server, SQL server, running for the last 3 weeks. And you can see the total I/O is eliminated on the left, the breakdown between how much of that was read I/O versus write I/O, and also you can see the storage time saved, which is pretty important. So the software is fully transparent on the level of benefits it's giving to any system. And when you do install the software, you want to give it at least 24 hours for the algorithms to adjust and start building up this type of data, and then go back and check it a few days later. So now this last slide here is really, really probably, actually second to the last slide, is probably the most important slide I want to mention, because of the best practices to get that 2x faster SQL experience. So one of the things is we want to make sure that memory is tuned properly on that system. Now, most systems already have enough memory. It's already got some free idle memory sitting there. You don't have to make any adjustments, no additions whatsoever. SQL and Exchange typically being exceptions. As we all know, SQL will gobble up and take all of the memory presented to it if you don't put a cap on it. So we want to just make sure that the memory tuning is in place. If you've don't have a memory limit on SQL, probably going to want to add one. Our goal is above the memory limit, we want to have on a busy big SQL server at least 16 gigs of free memory. Most run-of-the-mill, everyday, maybe not so heavy of the workload servers, 4 gigs, 6 gigs, more than sufficient. So we'll leave it at that for now. If you have specific questions about your environment, we can certainly consult with you one-on-one. SQL really is the sweet spot here, and to get the best results when you install the software, please do make sure you have that memory cap in place between 4 to 16 gigs of free memory. If it's a really big server, at least 16 gigs. That would be most ideal for you. The other thing, too, is physical servers. You're not going to probably be able to add any memory to a physical server, but you certainly could cap that and limit that memory. Now, the third step here that I want to talk about is just kind of pulling up that dashboard. As I mentioned, wait a few days, bring that up, start looking at the numbers, and then we can also hop on a call with one of our engineers to just see how things are going and if you're getting the most out of the software that you possibly can be. We'll move on to the last slide here. So just kind of the next steps here, getting you that NFR session, we'll move into the Q&A. So please keep dropping some questions into the chat room because we're going into the Q&A session here in just a second. But after the webinar, so the webinar is recorded. You'll get a link for it. You can re-listen to it, share it with colleagues. You'll also be getting the free complimentary NFR. And all you have to do is take it, download it, install it, and that should take you less than 5 minutes. Allow 24 hours for the algorithms, as I mentioned. Now, you see a big or there. The recommended approach is to take our trialware, which comes with the console, and the console is included with the product for free when you purchase it. But you can now evaluate this across all of the VMs on the same host. Remember I talked about the 2 I/O penalties. One is the Windows tax itself, which we fixed natively installed into the Windows OS. But the second is the blender effect, and having all of these Windows systems on the same host and all that cross-collateral damage, if you will, from the excess I/O from all of those servers. So if you install this across all the VMs on a host, that's your most ideal way to test this. Do it with trialware. Keep that free license in your back pocket, and once your trial is done, decide which of those servers you're going to benefit from the most and throw that free copy on that one server. So if you'd like to receive that free trialware, the free console, and be able to use it a little bit more broadly before you commit your free license to that one server you decide on, you can pop a note in the chat, just raise your hand, yeah, I'd like the evaluation, or you can respond to some of the emails we'll be sending you afterwards saying, send me over the evaluation, throw that over the fence for me. And so really we want to, wait probably a full week if you're going to be going that route, and then after a week, hop on a call, just review the dashboard, see what kind of benefits you're getting. And also, a lot of times people ask about licensing. One of the reasons we license by VM or by host is so that you can choose when you license by host, you're not installing anything on the host. You are installing on the VMs, but you can install on all of the VMs on that host. And that goes for VDI as well. So if you've got a very high VM density, you've got 80, 120 plus VDI clients on a host, just license the host. It's all you can eat. So with that said, Howard, I know we've gone over by a little bit here, but I did want to just pause here, Howard, and see if there's anything that I missed that you want to add on before we move into the full Q&A session.
I really can't think of too much there other than perhaps maybe I'd just like to, reemphasize just one more thing, and that's, something we've already pointed out, and that is to emphasize the limiting of memory in a SQL environment. So leaving a little bit of memory for us to use is really where you're going to get those big performance gains. And as, those of you who are listening and so forth, as you reach out to your account representative or a solutions engineer here at Conducive, we can point you to a knowledge-based article from Microsoft on how to limit that if you need some assistance. But that was really the only other thing I just wanted to mention there.
Okay, great. So thank you, Howard. And we'll jump into the Q&A here. And, clearly we're here to stand by to give you a free consultation if you need any assistance. And, Howard, it looks like I might actually have some questions in a private chat room, so I'm going to read a couple of these to you. It says, I'm not sure if everyone can see these or not. The first one is from Kwai Tan, and it says, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, we allow our SQL Server host to VMotion across our hosts as needed. How can Conducive help during these situations if this scenario is applicable? And I'm just going to repeat before you answer that, Howard, this session is being recorded. If anyone had a hard stop and needs to drop off, you will get a recording. You can kind of pick it up at minute 42 to get the Q&A session. We do hope you can stay on, though, and give us your question. So, Howard, over to you for this VMotion question.
So our software installs right inside the guest VM. So we're, linked in, connected, right there with the Windows operating system, the file system. That's where we see the I/O traffic. That's where we can help Windows do the optimization and so forth. So we're really, tightly coupled right inside that VM. So when you now do a VMotion or any type of storage migration or live migration, and that VM now is moved to a different host, just like all your other applications, it moves right along with it. We're part of that operating system, part of that environment, and so velocity just picks up right where it left off.
Great. And another question in the private chat room, I'm not sure if you can see this, is from Joe, and it says, can this work with a QuickBooks database?
Yes, it can.
Great.
No problem.
Another question in that room, the last one I see is from Rick, and he asks, well, one of the recommendations I've heard is that you should install this on the hypervisor too. How much of an additional increase happens if you do that?
You know, our recommendation really is not necessarily to put it on the hypervisor. In most general cases, you get the best performance by placing our software solution on each guest VM. Okay, that's where your applications live. That's where those applications are queuing up and generating I/O requests. That's where Windows starts interjecting that level of inefficiency. So we really want to be on the guest VM to do the best job. Now, there are cases where I might be able to substantiate a reason to put it on the host as well, if it's a Windows Hyper-V host, and that would be if that host is being used not only just for managing virtual machines, but you're also in that rare condition where you're using the host as though you would a physical Windows server, meaning that you're managing a major application there, in which case then you would want that application to receive the same kind of benefit that our products provide. So hopefully
Thank you, Howard.
And
if it doesn't, please add follow-up questions into the room. And Howard, we've got a question from Troy. Hey, Troy. Good to hear from you. And the question is, what was the largest significant change from previous versions of Velocity to this version of Velocity? And Howard, for me, I think reporting was a huge one, but I'll turn that question over to you.
Well, you know, hey, Troy, great to hear from you, my friend. It's been a long time since we've spoken. Great question. Thanks for the softball toss-up there. So the biggest improvement or biggest change there, not only the reporting, but I got to mention the fact that we now no longer need a reboot to install our software or to do upgrades of the software from all the way back to version 5.3, I'm sorry, moving forward. So any upgrades or new fresh installs no longer require a reboot and no longer require a reboot to uninstall. So that and the reporting were the two significant major enhancements.
That's great. Troy's got another question here. He said, if our SQL Server has only smaller I/O writes, how would Velocity benefit on smaller workloads as opposed to larger workloads where the I/O is greater into the megabyte or gigabyte range?
Well, you know, since we are an I/O solution optimization type of product there, okay, each system does contribute to the overall I/O workload. You know, the systems that are doing the vast majority of the I/O traffic, obviously they're going to see benefit. But don't discount those systems that may not seem as busy or as important, okay, because they are sharing I/O bandwidth. They are sharing I/O resources down to the storage level. So as a result, if you get the best performance benefit by placing our software on all the guest VMs on a given host for all the machines that are accessing the same common storage array, simply because the combined effect of us eliminating all that extra noisy, unnecessary I/O traffic. And there may be cases where eliminating the I/O traffic from some of those less busier systems is actually what's causing the performance problem in the first place. So if we can cut out some of their I/O traffic, then naturally all the other applications have greater accessibility or bandwidth capability and don't have to compete as much for the I/O traffic or resources.
And thank you, Howard. And the next question I'll answer is a question that says, why would I get Velocity if I'm about to buy a brand new hardware or replace aging hardware? And that's a really interesting question. And what actually ends up happening is that some of the largest purchases that happen on Velocity are for people who are upgrading their entire infrastructure. Just received an order for 40 hosts at an organization doing just that. They're refreshing everything. And the answer to that question really comes from probably best said by a customer that I'm actually just waiting to get an approval to publish their case study, so I won't say their name here, but they're down in Orange County, and Howard and I were just on site with them a month or so ago, and he had upgraded his Unity well, he upgraded from an older hybrid /SAN to Unity 4 recently, and he's got 95,000 IOPS coming in the door. Keeping our software, already had it. And he said, no, for me, I'm going to have 90,000 IOPS. I'm only using 10,000 of them. And he goes, but the 10,000 I'm using are really, really important to me. I need to make sure that that is performing at its peak. And in fact, when the guys came in to scale and size his new environment, they looked at it and they said, you only need a Unity 3. And he said, no, give me a Unity 4. I'm going to keep this thing for 7 years like I just kept my last SAN. And I need to be able to handle the growth and the unknown applications and everything that's going to be coming into it. And I/O is critical. So I may be there today, but even my performance right now is going to be offloaded and 30 to 40% served right from VMs. You can think of this as server-side optimization. And the only reason people don't optimize the Windows operating system is because they don't know they can. But our software does that. So you're going to get the best hardware you can. You get the best network, the most bandwidth you possibly can. Why wouldn't you do the exact same treatment to the Windows operating system and literally get back 30 to 40% of all of that I/O and just have everything go through so smoothly so you're processing now and give yourself all that headroom for the future? Most people that are buying us today are buying us for hyper-converged. They've got HCI. They're going with all flash. That's what most people are buying right now, and they're dropping us in as part of that solution. So it's a good question. Let me see if there's additional questions in here. Scroll down a little bit. So one other question here is Microsoft running a light version or an older version of Diskkeeper to defragment the Windows OS today? So Howard, I'll turn that one over to you.
Well, it's no secret that, being in the industry for as long as we have, 37 years, Microsoft came to us and asked us for to develop a solution that would help calm the waters, so to speak, in terms of people complaining about, performance issues related to fragmentation. So we did create the underlying technology that's embedded in Windows that allows for the safe movement of data. We also did provide Microsoft with the basis for a very rudimentary type of defrag solution. But what we're talking about today is not defrag, okay? What we're talking about is really the ultimate solution in terms of if we can reduce the I/O traffic by preventing the fragmentation from happening. Now you're not talking about defrag. We're talking about preventative type of action, such that files and free space don't become as badly fragmented. And then there are sophisticated engines that are only available in our solution, not in the Microsoft solution. That takes it a step further in determining what can be done to further reduce the I/O traffic. So thanks very much for the question. Absolutely, we did provide a lot of intelligence to Microsoft into the Windows file system. We're one of, less than 5 companies that have ever had access to the source code of Windows, and that's a pretty good feather in our cap.
Thank you, Howard. And so Troy is really putting us to work today. And just a housekeeping item, we will be ending the webinar at the top of the hour. So if you've got additional questions, throw them in there now so we can get to them. And if we can't get to them, we will answer you privately after the webinar is over. So appreciate it. Pretty much everybody is still on from the beginning of the webinar. It's great. So Howard, here's another technical, not a softball, Troy's thrown at you. He goes, what is the maximum contiguous write that IntelliWrite is able to do? Is it limited to what the volume is formatted out to, i.e., where you have an NTFS partition with 64K block size, will velocity scale out and optimize any size of I/O?
We're not actually modifying or changing the size of the I/O request. We're helping Windows allocate the space in a more efficient manner. I/O allocation is actually handled by the application and passed through to Windows. So Windows is still in complete control, in charge of the I/Os, okay? We're just providing that intelligence so Windows does a better job.
Thank you. And then a question from Ingo. It says, how does this work if you're doing database mirroring to another SQL server?
Just like if you didn't have mirroring, it all happens transparently in the background. So whatever one system is told to do, that mirrored system does things identically the same way.
Okay, great. And Troy's got a question. He says, where's the optimization on the older SAN fiber channel? How would Velocity optimize that?
Well, if we step back just for a second and look at, we're agnostic to the type of hardware. It doesn't matter to our solution set that it's the latest and greatest type of storage array or older style type of technology. Windows is Windows, and that's where the performance problem is creeping in. So what we're able to do, and to answer the question a little more directly, if you have an older, SAN fiber channel type connection there, okay, if we can prevent the extra I/O traffic from occurring within the Windows operating system, then that older SAN type of storage technology will be getting fewer I/Os, getting bombarded with fewer I/Os, such that it now has more bandwidth capability to do other useful work. So think of us as providing that extra I/O capacity to both new and old type of storage technologies.
Excellent. Another question here. Does Velocity store the MFT of the mapped out disk or load the MFT into Velocity so it is able to access the data quicker, or is it all based from the upfront I/O?
Oh, man, I got to guess Troy probably threw that question at me. Good
Troy
one,
said
Troy.
that. Yeah, Troy threw that.
So I'm going to have to go out there and say, I can't dip too deep into the secret sauce of exactly how we do these things, but we are aware of the specific metadata information, things like the $MFT, the $bitmap file, the $secure file. So we know exactly what the file system is doing at any given point in time. We do not need to preload all of that information or use an a large amount of memory to duplicate that effort. We can kind of poke our head into reading some of that information and make intelligent decisions based upon the workload that's occurring at the system at that exact moment in time.
Excellent. And then Troy's got another question. Does the software run on the newer servers, i.e. Server 2016 and Windows 10?
Yes, it does.
Great. And then just going down these in order, so Inga, we'll definitely get you the eval. Troy, we will definitely get you the eval. And Chad, I've got yours as well. Stephen's got a question. Is this product targeting VM environments, or can it be used on an ERP system with SQL Server on it? And yes, it can be used physical or virtual. It can be used on an ERP system with SQL Server on it, no problem. You can go either way. In fact, this can even be used in Azure, AWS, so if your server's sitting in the cloud and you need some optimization. In fact, a lot of folks use this in AWS or Azure so that they can get away with paying for slower disk speeds and still get Flash-like performance by throwing our stuff in there. So that's a cost savings to them. Howard, question from David. He asks, I am assuming this will also work on file sharing?
Yes, it will.
Okay,
file
great.
Share, so long as it's a Windows operating system environment, Windows 2008 R2 and newer, we're good to go.
Perfect. Yana asks, will this software work on a physical box with 2 SQL Server instances?
Yes, it will. Multiple SQL instances make no challenge for us. At a Windows file system level, IOs are IOs are IOs. It doesn't matter what application or database you have. It's sitting inside a Windows partition or disk volume, and those IOs are all treated and look the same regardless of the application or database in question.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining the call today. And if you had any last-minute questions that you didn't get into the chat window, certainly email them in to us after you receive your free NFR. Those will be being sent out immediately after the webinar is over. So if you don't see them in the next hour or two, check your spam filters, reach out to us to make sure that you got them. And then, again, we've got a couple people raising their hands for the full experience of the trial where with the host. Again, just reply back to our emails if you want to get that as well, and we'll be happy to send that to you. We're going to call it a wrap, and appreciate everybody's attendance and for sticking on with us for the whole hour. And Howard, thank you as well for your time and expertise on the call today.
My pleasure, Jennifer, and hello to everybody out there. Thanks very much for participating and joining in the webinar.